So I was recently recommended to check out the Gravel Institute, an institute that's supposedly reactionary to that of the PragerU. PragerU, for those of you who don't really understand who they are, a conservative sort of movement. They defend that of capitalism. I think the only critique that I have of PragerU, there isn't enough argument to make very clear that we do not live under capitalism today. I feel that there could be more argument made to make the distinction between capitalism and that of corporatism. But other than that, I think a lot of their arguments are very sound and I really enjoy their videos. So a video that was recently posted by the Gravel Institute is in critique of capitalism, of course, in relation to freedom. This is a very strange one. Just have a listen to what she says here.
If you're an American, you've probably heard this one before. Capitalism means freedom. With the liberty of the free market, the thinking goes, individuals are empowered to make their own decisions. Sounds good, right? If you buy into this logic, then any alternative with more role for the public seems oppressive and tyrannical. One where other people make all the decisions for you. Appealing in theory. In practice, not true. Our economy isn't about freedom at all. Just the opposite.
She says our economy today, we're not living under capitalism today. Capitalism is about freedom. It's about the free market. It's about the separation of the economy from government. Where's this free market today? A free market means that you have interest rates set freely in the marketplace by the laws of supply and demand. It means you have the ratio of money set freely in the marketplace. It means that your money itself, not a currency that's counterfeit, but actual money is determined by the market, by the people. That's not what you have today. You have a system where central banks are controlling and manipulating the interest rates and the reserve ratios, fraudulently took away the gold standard, which was part of free market money, which is to do with capitalism, and they imposed a fiat currency upon people that nobody asked for. Where in this economy today is there capitalism? It's a mixed economy. You're living under corporatism, not capitalism. Corporatism is not the same thing as capitalism. Corporatism is a special interest favour system. It's a system that rewards failure and punishes success. You've probably heard of the term capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. In other words, all it really means is that people are paying for it. But however, when you force people to pay for it, when you use government to subsidise, when you use government to force them into a collective group, and then you force taxation out of their pockets to redistribute and subsidise the losses of others, that is socialism. So what they mean when they say it's socialism for the rich, because the rich get to live for free off of all their own losses. They basically pay for all those losses through taxpayers' money. Now that's not capitalism. Capitalism is an individualist system. And individualism most certainly does not mean that you have some government controlling and dictating, directing the economy. That's what you have today. You have a system where government is rewarding losses. It's directing who the winners and losers are. That's not capitalism. We've already got recorded history there to speak for itself. What led to this corporatist system wasn't because of the freedom of the marketplace, in other words, what defines capitalism. It was to do with that of all of the socialist government interventionism. If you were living in a 100% capitalist system, you'd be living under anarcho-capitalism. It just isn't the case. You're not. Yes, there's to a varying degree in the question of scale, the presence of socialism, and of course it's got its presence in parts of the economy. A good example of that would be the fixing of the interest rates. So when she speaks about that of today's economy, she's pretty much speaking about that of corporatism, not capitalism.
American capitalism today is defined by an overwhelming lack of freedom for the vast majority of people and incredible dictatorial power for a few people at the very top.
It's just like the argument from Second Thought. You're always going to get these baseless, silly claims and assertions. Somehow, all the wealth and power is going into the hands of the few. And talking about the rich getting richer and poor getting poorer. You can watch my video that I did in response on Second Thought. And of course, I provided the quotes from Thomas J. De Lorenzo's excellent book, How Capitalism Saved America. I provided the information of the 19th century. What they don't acknowledge is the fact that their government statistics are very static. They don't realise that after each decade, the bottom 20% continuously changes. It's not the same people. It's not the same families. They continuously change. They're moving up the ladder.
That's because we have allowed big corporate monopolies to take over a lot of the work of government and replace public institutions with private for-profit ones.
It's down to government's intervention. Capitalism is an individualist system. There is no way for you to remove capitalism from individualism. It would be irrational to do so. If you want to remove capitalism from individualism, you're going to have to correlate it to some degree to collectivism. And capitalism is an antinomous system to that of collectivism. Now, of course, in the mixed economy, you have the presence of capitalism, a mixture between individualism and collectivism. We don't deny that fact. And in turn, individualism defines the free market, defines the separation of the economy from government. Why they do not like being forced away from left versus right to that of individualism versus collectivism is because it's very clear of what individualism means. I mean, what are they going to tell you? That capitalism somehow has something in relation to do with collectivism? Because collectivism is synonymous to that of socialism. In the 19th century, we saw the period of the so-called robber barons, which was a myth. Monopolies stemmed from that of government's interference in the market, in the economy. That's anti-capitalist. The reason why there's never been 100% capitalism, to some varying degree or another, even during the 19th century, you would see the government interference, whether it was through the protectionist tariffs, the corporate subsidies, because capitalism is about the voluntary exchange. It's not about government taxation through protectionist tariffs, etc., etc. Between 1885 to 1890, you'd eventually see the Sherman Antitrust Law Act. The antitrust law legislation was brought in supposedly to break up these evil monopolies. Never in recorded history has a monopoly ever stemmed from predatory pricing. Even the myth that they claimed about that of Standard Oil, John Davis and Rockefeller claiming that he used predatory pricing. What does predatory pricing mean? It means to slightly reduce your prices below your competition. Once you wipe them out, what was the mainstream narrative that they claimed about Rockefeller? They said that he then drove his prices up and shafted the consumer. Well, this is complete opposite of the truth. Because in 1869, it would cost more than 30 cents per barrel of oil. In fact, it kept on dropping, so much so that even after gaining 90% share of the market, it continued to drop right down to 5.9 cents per barrel of oil into 1897. That could only come from an increase of productive output. There is only one way that you can create a monopoly. That is by restricting productive output. The claim alone about predatory pricing was a myth. It's all theoretical nonsense. Predatory pricing would never be allowed to form. It would be taken advantage of, just like what Herbert Dow did, and you even see this today in auction sites. Take for example the famous eBay. On eBay you have a lot of people who actually go on, buy up products for cheaper and sell it off at a higher price. You see that all the time. So since there's only one way that you're going to create a monopoly, more or less, by restricting productive output, the very fact that during the period of the robber barons, these industries were vastly increasing productive output, they were benefiting the consumer. In fact, so much so that the consumer price index continuously dropped all the way from 1840 right up to 1900. That contradicts their entire narrative of claiming that monopolies had formed all due to somehow something to do with capitalism. Those industries were greatly benefiting the consumer. The real rationale behind the government's intervention was not in favour of the consumer, it was against the consumer. That's why you see all of these monopolies today, because of government's intervention. Not because of the market, but because of government's interference. An example of that, like I gave before, was the American Medical Association monopoly. The American Medical Association is a cartel created by government, and all thanks to government's intervention and of course the American Medical Association, it basically enabled them to close down all the medical schools and create a monopoly in the marketplace. And of course we would see more cartelization. We would see this with the collusion with the private pharmaceutical companies. Now that was created by government's intervention through the third-party payer system. How can you blame capitalism for what's the fault of government's interference in the market. There is no rationale behind that argument. Capitalism's the separation of the economy from government.
They have gobbled up small and medium-sized businesses so they can set all the terms.
But what created that problem? What created the problem was the very government's interference through strong government regulation. What's that got to do with capitalism? Capitalism is about the market being left be to the free market to freely regulate itself. Just like how interest rates would be freely regulated in the marketplace. Well, all prices would be regulated freely in the marketplace. The economy itself would be regulated freely. It's not to have government step in with quantity and quality controls, etc. And just like the Sherman Antitrust Act, its real rationale was basically to protect the inefficient from the more efficient. Over time, through the more and more government's interference, it stamped out the competition of smaller business people, weighed them down because they can't afford the cost of the heavier government regulation. The more thousands and thousands of pages of government regulation came around, not only was it costlier, it became too complicated. The big corporations, etc., they had the advantage because they had the money to pay people to find loopholes in the government's regulation, so they gained a competitive advantage. Again, what the hell is government's interference got to do with the definition of capitalism in relation to do with the free market? Nothing.
You hear a lot about the freedom to choose, but what does that freedom really mean? Sure, we can choose between different eyeglass companies until we learn they are all owned by the same company behind the scenes.
Again, folks, she's gone on about this to do with today's economy, to do with corporatism. The freedom to choose is in relation to do with the free market. It's not to do with this corporatist system today. Corporatist system where giant corporations dominate the market and has more or less strangled competition half to death. Don't get me wrong, you've got some competition to some varying degree in the market, but it's nothing to what it would be like in a free market. It's this mixed economy. That's why you've got corporatism. It's not because you live under a capitalist system.
And when it comes to work, where most people spend most of their time, people don't have much freedom at all. Despite claims that workers freely enter into a contract to sell their labor, there's no free choice between working and not working. In a country like ours, where 40% of people can't scrape together $400 in an emergency, the reality is that you either work or you starve.
You know, I thought Slime's argument was very infantile over this, to do with, you know, if you don't work then you'll starve, and it's really infantile. Folk, think about it this way. Before anything even reaches your shelves, that includes food. Where does food come from? Well, food would come from the land itself. That's why you've got farms. Farms sell their goods to that of the supermarkets, and the supermarkets store the food, and of course you can buy them from the supermarkets. It requires work in order for you to produce the food to begin with. What's she trying to say? That you can just go with life without even having to work? The whole problem with today's economy and why prices soar out of control, such as the private sector costs, and why they can't afford the healthcare, etc., was to blaming all of the socialist government interference. And it goes back to that argument. When we speak about the monopolies, she mentioned something about for-profit. These are people who are very ignorant of economics. They've never studied prices. They couldn't tell you what profits and losses are. Profits aren't just something you fill your own pockets with. Profits are signals, just as losses are every bit as important in terms of signals. Profits are the information the consumer demand is dictating and driving. The profits is the information you gather from the consumers, telling you what consumers' needs and wants are. If you oppose profits, you basically oppose the consumer. That's why these people are clueless about economics.
You don't have several months to take time off and carefully choose a good employer. In order to survive, people submit to working menial, unrewarding jobs for little pay, no security, and bad benefits. And once they're on the job, that lack of freedom only gets worse. When we go to work, we check our hard-won rights at the door, and your employers rule over you night and day.
Again, this is really all to do with employment, and what she's going on about here is to do with the exploitation. You're not living under a capitalist system to begin with. When you've got a large supply of people who are unemployed, and they're all chasing the one job, employing cheap labour and exploiting people because they've got a vast array of options, they can easily pay someone off and replace them. That's because of the very interference by government that's enabled that to happen because of the absence of competition. Now, I've stated before, and I'll say it again, you're never going to get rid of exploitation 100%, just as you're never going to get rid of corruption 100%. Anybody who believes in such a system live in a utopian fantasy world. They're not basing things on real world solutions to problems. Every socialist regime that you've ever seen, they're basically arguing for what? For you to work for absolutely nothing. And trust me, there are jobs out there you're going to have to spend a lot of hard work doing. And even if she isn't arguing for communism, money only comes from two places, and I reiterate this fact. It only comes from either the private sector or the printing press. So what's she saying? Does she want to run the printing press, which will devalue the base of the currency and drive you towards hyperinflation and drive the cost of goods and services up? Because that's essentially what happens when running the printing press. She's got no other option but to turn to the private sector. So you can see the flaw in her entire argument. Doesn't have a clue about economics.
Big corporations like Amazon punish workers for speaking out. Many corporations are now spying on workers' political activities. They intrude into people's private lives, monitor their social media, and regulate their breaks.
Yeah, okay, I can admit the fact that I don't think it's right for those to go into people's social life and their own personal life and judge them on those types of things. And I agree on that. Of course, when you oppose the free market and you speak about intrusion in people's private life, well, what the hell do you think you're doing through that of using government in a collective society to force your will upon everybody else?
And when the boss decides to fire you, there's no due process. Like a feudal lord, he can fire and punish workers at will. In practice, American workplaces are like private governments, where the freedoms we associate with democracy don't exist.
First off, I really don't have a clue how anybody could draw the comparison between a collectivist system that involved communal ownership of property in the absence of secure private property rights before the enclosure movement with that of, capitalism, because feudalism was a top-down structural system based on economic central planning that defined socialism, the political centralisation that defined socialism, the collective ownership of the means of production that defines socialism. And of course, then she goes on about to do with private governments. What the hell is that? I mean, governments are governments. There's nothing private about it. When you speak about government ownership, it's public ownership.
When we clock in, we become subjects, not citizens.
And I would even go as far as to question the whole thing on this issue to do with working for private companies, as if private companies can do whatever they like. Well, in the free market, you would be faced with the reality that you've got your business reputation to look after, and how you treat your own workers will pass off onto the customers. You need to have a happy workforce, a workforce that's content in order to have any sort of success in a free market under a capitalist system. Now, the problem in today's economy is the fact that you get away with this because you have a government interfering that gets to pick and choose winners and losers. And what government does is it props failure up. It basically rewards the failure, rewards the incompetency through socialist government subsidies. That's why you've seen the legally protected fraud of the bad banks. In a capitalist system, they would have faced liquidation. They would have went under. They wouldn't have been protected. The incompetency is being rewarded. That's why they're getting away with doing all of this. In a capitalist system, they wouldn't be in that position because they would be forced to pay for their own losses. They'd be forced to face up to that of competition. Competition like you've never seen before. And believe me, the competition would wipe the floor with them if they damaged their own business reputation. There's the difference.
Without anti-monopoly regulations to restrict their size, or labor unions to contest their power over employees, corporations and their wealthy CEOs have as much power over ordinary people as any government agency, if not more.
Well, like I pointed out earlier on, folk, the very giant trusts of the late 19th century that were accused of holding monopolies, they were the ones benefiting the consumers the most. The ones who were charging the higher prices were the very smaller business people who were inefficient, knew they could not compete with the likes of Rockefeller. So what did they do? They lobbied Congress for special interest favours. Corporatism, in other words, economic fascism. Basically, hurting the consumer by going against the very efficient competitors, such as your Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and Stanfords, etc., weighing them down through government legislation and propping inefficiency up. The very people who were incompetent and charging higher prices. Even the nationalisation that led to the De Beers Group gaining a near-perfect monopoly. You see this over and over. Government's intervention does not protect you from the monopolies, it creates them. It's why you're living under this monopolistic system today. So how then can you justify government's interference in the marketplace? If government's interference created the problem, why support more government?
Despite the lie that our market is free, most industries are dominated by a few massive firms.
Did you just defend the free market economy there? Did you just defend capitalism subconsciously? It's laughable. You start the video off by critiquing capitalism, or so you thought you were critiquing capitalism. Because you don't even understand economics, you then defend capitalism. That's unreal.
Instead of free competition, the status quo is monopoly control. Huge corporations set the terms and manage the economy from their perch at the top of the market, deciding who succeeds and who fails.
Government is the one picking and choosing winners and losers. After all, the government's regulation, the government's interference, is the one weighing down all the smaller competition. It's the one that gets to choose where the subsidies go. It's called socialising the losses and capitalising the gains, or you may want to call it privatising the gains and socialising the losses. In other words, it's using socialism to force society into a collective group, to subordinate their individual rights. That's right. Collectivism, anti-individualism, anti-capitalism, to force society collectively to pay for the losses of others. But I'm confused because at the same time you seem to acknowledge the fact that there's no free competition. Unless, of course, you seem to believe that somehow free competition was what led to this mess.
When Facebook decides to promote a political agenda to benefit itself, who can stop them? When Amazon decides it doesn't like a particular book, that book can vanish from the place most everyone buys books. When Pfizer decides to raise insulin prices ahead of a shareholders meeting, it's done, and people die as a result. Every day, decisions that affect millions of people are made not by everyone in a democratic manner, but by unelected people who have profits and not the well-being of others in mind.
First and foremost, it's down to people's own choice where they go. I would admit that there's a problem. What's that got to do with capitalism? You know, and this is the issue. It's just this assumption because, it's private companies, therefore blah, blah, blah. It's the corporatist system that's enabled this. And the beauty of the free market, I mean, theirs was an example of library. And library's a platform that came around that's decentralised. The sheer lunacy for anybody to say, it's a for-profit system, it's for profits. Profits are consumers' needs and wants. If you oppose profits, good luck trying to run an economy efficiently.
That's the problem at the heart of our system. Elected officials are always expressing concern about government intrusion into our private lives. But they're happy to let corporations take advantage of us in ways that would be unconstitutional for any democratic government. The hard truth is that despite what you hear, the modern American economy is not about the freedom to choose. In job markets where you either get a job or you die, in workplaces where the boss is king, and in marketplaces dominated by huge abusive monopolies, you don't have much of a choice at all. I'm Zephyr Teachout, professor of law at Fordham Law School for the Gravel Institute.
Professor of law at the Fordham Law School, and you haven't even got a clue what capitalism is. You can't even make the distinction between corporatism and capitalism, and you're the professor of law. See, if you're feeding people the wrong information, they're going away believing that nonsense. Yet the funny thing was, you later conceded and then stated the fact that it's not a free market. So folk, I hope it's been educational enough for yourself. If you get anything you would like to add yourself, comment in the comment section below. If you'd like to ask, again, comment below and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you for watching my video, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.